So people who are thinkers say things like, I think that, I know that. People who are feelers say that really feels a certain way to me. And people who are doers talk about their bodies. So they might say like, it's something I saw the other day, or I just feel like I'm just going to do it. They're more instinctual gut people. And so that's part of the listening process. The Enneagram has become a big part of the listening process for me in terms of hearing what people are deeply saying without even sometimes knowing what they're expressing.
Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Kristen Donnelly and I am one of the good doctors of Abbey Research. You are very welcome to this video, which is an entry into our series called Welcome to My World, and I'll get to that in a minute. Abbey Research is completely committed to the idea that curiosity can change the world, because honestly, it's the only thing that ever has. We change our minds and expand our worldview through stories and relationships. We may change temporary behaviors through shaming or statistics, but we don't actually change our minds about things by being yelled at that we're wrong. So we at Abbey Research, both Dr. Aaron and myself, we have social science PhDs, and our entire passion is to help people have a mental posture of empathy and understanding. And so that's what this series is in service of. Like I said, it's called Welcome to My World. And I chat to fascinating folks from all over the place who are different than me, which is, everybody. And about something that is in their lives that would help the rest of us human better. I just think that the more we get to know people, the deeper and richer our human experience can be. And I do have actual research to back that up. But in the meantime, I just really like having conversations. So today I am super excited to be joined by Aaron Maines, who is a massive lover of music and did the professional music scene in Nashville for a little while, and was actually a marketing and content director for the global entertainment brands Warner Music Group and Entertainment One, and Grammy and Dove award-winning artists. For those of you, unlike us, who did not grow up in evangelical Christianity, Dove Awards are the Christian music Grammys, and they are a circus in their own right. And he has been connecting art and content to faith for over 2 decades. In the mid-2000s, Aaron's personal faith went through a deconstruction, just like mine did, in the midst of early progressive church movement. This journey has become part of Aaron's call to spiritual direction. We're going to talk about that, leading faithful ragamuffins and pilgrims to find new faith experiences. For anyone who grew up in our faith tradition, you will hear the word ragamuffin and know just what that means. But for anybody who hasn't, it's a bit of the idea that we all get to be messy people. That's really what it comes down to. Today, Aaron is following his call to tell his story honestly and to recognize and encourage other people to find God in their journey rather in their destination. Lord, if I had had this when I was a kid. Aaron is a spiritual director, a knower of the Enneagram, a haphazard practitioner of spiritual practices. I'm stealing that, friend. A wisdom person and a host of the Reconstruction Calls podcast, one of my personal faves. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, Kristen, thanks for having me. It's good to be here today.
This is fun. Full disclosure, Aaron's wife and I are good friends and talk on a regular basis, but this is actually our first time ever interacting face-to-face. So this is a treat for both of us. Aaron, if you wouldn't mind starting us off and telling us exactly what is spiritual direction.
Yeah, sure. I like to think about it in pretty common terms. Like, who do you talk to about God? I know a lot of people talk about God in funny places. So they might talk about God at a bar or in a living room or around the dinner table or in a church or a worship center or a synagogue or a temple. Those are all fine places to talk about God for sure. In the same way, I like to think sometimes about a spiritual director, like you would think like an accountant. Like, sure, you can talk to your friends about accounting. They might like that, or they might not. But the best person to talk to about God is an accountant. To talk to about accounting is an accountant. And so in a similar way, a spiritual director is sometimes called a spiritual companion. And so the director part is a direction, or director part is a little mystifying a bit. It's not like they're like a principal or anything, or it's not like I'm a principal or anything. Typically a spiritual director, or maybe like spiritual coach or spiritual companion, is someone who's received some kind of training, hopefully some kind of training. And a lot of that is about listening. And so what I love about spiritual direction is it works a lot like talk therapy would work. So typically it's one-on-one. It might be in person or over Zoom or something like that. It's been over Zoom for the last year or so. So, there aren't a lot of agendas. The spiritual director typically is just a trained listener. And so what is really beautiful, and some of the things that I notice is that people tell you their stories, and they tell you like their deeply held beliefs in just the words that they use. And so, and truthfully, they tell you about God in the simplicity of their words. So oftentimes we think about God as being in a place, or if God is not a good word for you, sometimes it's the universe or the divine or anything like that. So typically spiritual direction is not a denominationally based thing. So, and it's not really about the director either. And so what you bring to the table, the director is there to be supportive of you, to listen to you and help you in a way talk through your belief system and how you're interacting and experiencing God in your day-to-day life. That's really my hope, is that I'm helping to create and foster experiences with God with people. And so oftentimes we think about that only happening in like a church setting, but the vast majority of Americans profess that they experience God. They have some kind of mystical experience with God, and they may not even use those terms. And so I was drawn to spiritual direction just out of wanting to talk about that, honestly. And so I end up talking, it's sort of a funny thing. Becoming a spiritual director, people end up telling me their stuff, whether I am ready to listen to them or not. So there was a big
That's how it was with me and becoming a social worker. Like I'm in bars and I'm getting people's entire life story. I'm like, okay, here we are. Yeah.
Like I will go get a haircut and someone will tell me all about how they're getting divorced because of all this crazy stuff that happened, and then they'll start crying. And I've gotten more used to that. But for a while it was really strange. But so spiritual direction is not, it sounds like this daunting thing, but it's really not. There's a couple of different traditions of it. And so especially out of some of the like deeper mystical faiths. So I'm going to say Catholic. I mean, people don't think that necessarily is like a mystical faith, but there's certainly, it comes out of the it comes out of the Jesuit arm of the Catholics. And then the Sufis have a lot of that sort of deep spiritual work that they do. And so there's just an element of that. And again, it's not denominational. And so I hope I answered your question well.
Yeah,
but,
no, I love it.
I do just like to say it's essentially a trained person that you talk to God. You talk about God. With.
Like, I love this idea of it being a coach. Like so I have a speaker coach and I've got an energy coach that I work with. And so having a spiritual coach would also be like really within line. I was under the impression that there was more like theology training as part of this, that it was more of a bit of a specific denominational thing. And I love this idea that it's just about listening, and it's somebody who themselves is a faith-based person. And therefore, I mean, like, this is one of my things with always going to a therapist, for instance, is if so much of my garbage and my emotional stuff is tied up into my church journey, that if you don't know, like I always joke, like, if you don't know who DC Talk is, I'm not sure you can be my therapist. Like it's a big part of things. If you've never heard of Louis Giglio, I can't help you. And so having these kind of, because my ideas about God are so tied up in what my culture told me about God for so long, that I need to have somebody to kind of guide that. So I really, really love this idea of listening. But I'll say, when you were talking about that people disclose to you all the time, I was sharing that in a room full of social workers. This happened to me a lot when I lived in Northern Ireland. Like, I was famous for getting people's entire life stories out of them. And everyone's like, I didn't even know that about my spouse. And I was like, yeah, so they told me their whole lives.
Yeah.
And somebody pointed out to me that I thought was very interesting, is that those of us who are trained to listen hold our bodies differently in conversations. And we signal safety without even consciously realizing it.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to me of like how much people crave to be heard.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. People have said that to me, like they feel safe. And sometimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing that makes you feel safe. But I'm glad to do it. People transmit so much through their bodies. That's one of the things that, from an Enneagram perspective, that's one of the things that people do in a big way, unknowingly. So the words we use, the things we say. So if you're an Enneagram person, some baseline ideas are that there are kind of three areas of the body that we act from. And so that's our head, heart, and gut. In a more Christian way to say, you would say like body, soul, and spirit. It's the idea that we're thinkers, we're doers, or we're feelers. And so oftentimes when people talk, it's the words they use. So people who are thinkers say things like, I think that, I know that. People who are feelers say that really feels a certain way to me. And people who are doers talk about their bodies. So they might say like, it's something I saw the other day, or I just feel like I'm just going to do it. They're more instinctual gut people. And so that's part of the listening process. The Enneagram has become a big part of the listening process for me, in terms of hearing what people are deeply saying without even sometimes knowing what they're expressing. And then oftentimes people will touch parts of their body when they talk. So feelers are heart people, and they often, when they are feeling something deeply, they will cover their hearts. Or people will touch their heads, like thinkers touch their heads. I think body people just are all body all the time. So there's not necessarily something that they're doing that's an indication, but it is part of some training, and then part of the experience of it is just noticing some of those things, noticing the way people move and act and talk, and what they're communicating, more than just beyond the words that they're saying. But the words are really important as well.
I love this, and I could chase that for a little bit, but this is the first time we've talked about the Enneagram on my channel.
Okay.
So could you really briefly explain the Enneagram?
Sure. The Enneagram is sort of an ancient typology system. That's the easiest way to think about it. So when I say that, most people you might think of Myers-Briggs or Strength Finders, and yes, it is similar in nature to those. The Enneagram ultimately is what it expresses and what it explains in a way, to me, that I've done all of those things, DISC and Myers-Briggs and soul types, and I've done all those things, and I like all those things. When I stumbled across the Enneagram about 10 years ago, it was the first time it knew things about me that I knew deeply that no one else knew about me. And what it does, at its core, is it expresses a motivation. And
that's
so
the difference for me too, is that it was the first, like when I read my type, like when I finally kind of landed on my type, I was like, oh yeah, this is why I do what I do.
Yeah. And so I use it in spiritual direction. I'm wrapping up a certification in it, just like a more formal, official certification badge. But I use it in spiritual direction to listen to people. And a lot of people are just talking about it generally, like it's really popular. So I use it in spiritual direction. I do Enneagram typing interviews. A lot of people take a test. That's not my preferred way for you to sort of discover your energy or your type. There's a better way to do it, but the test isn't bad either. The test often will leave you so the idea is that there's 9 types. There's 9 energies or 9 lenses in the world. And we all operate with one of those lenses. And so like every kind of person operates. So each person has their own lens that they operate from. And then there's a lot more that goes into that. We could go on for hours about the Enneagram. I certainly could. And so it's sort of where your motivation comes from. To tie it into psychology, it does come out of, in a sense, Jungian practice. It's tied to our temperaments, and then it's ultimately tied to our ego development. The idea that we are born in a way that has a temperament, and then that temperament shapes out into an ego. And that ego is a defensive posture that we use to move through the world. And so essentially there are 9 different defensive postures that we take on. And then I believe what I love about it and why I believe in it so much is that it helps us take those things apart. And so a big part of my work in spiritual direction is helping people do what's called deconstructing faith. And really getting the way the Enneagram expresses is that we get back to our essence. It's who we ultimately were born to be. It's how we know God in the deepest, truest sense of ourselves. It's the language that our soul speaks. And so if we can get back to that, that takes a lot. So personally, that takes a lot of ego deconstruction. On the spiritual side, it takes a lot of spiritual deconstruction. But what I believe is best about the Enneagram is it gives us a place to reconstruct from. It knows the virtues, and it knows these holy ideas that helps us point us in a new way that we can go. And so if you're willing to do the work, it certainly can, it invites you, the Enneagram invites you, unlike maybe Strengths Finders invites us just to lean into our strengths. The real invitation to me of the Enneagram is to take your ego apart. And that's pretty scary. But if you're on a mission to kind of find your truest, authentic self, I think the Enneagram is probably the best place to start.
Yeah, and I can definitely talk about the Enneagram forever as well. So maybe that can be part 2 of our conversation,
Sure.
Aaron. But I'm curious, what made you land on spiritual direction as a calling?
Well, I would say that's just it. It's on a certain way of calling. One, to tie it back to the Enneagram, one of the funny things about the Enneagram is when you sort of learn your type, it really introduces itself to you in a really negative way, because usually you're like, I really do not want to do that. I do not want to be that. I do not want to do that. But if I'm really honest, that's who I am. So spiritual direction was, in a sense, that way. My life makes sense headed towards spiritual direction. So there are elements where people are disclosing things to me, and I don't really know why. I do know that I ask a lot of questions of people. Like when I go to a party, I'm kind of the interviewer. Or like if people come over, I ask people. I'm genuinely curious all the time. And so I like to know things about people, and I don't love small talk. So I will ask you, like after 20 minutes, I will ask you something kind of deep just to see where it goes. So that's part of it. So in a sense, I have this, people kind of disclose things to me. I've always been a spiritual person, and I grew up essentially in kind of I would now say kind of a cultish Christian environment. And through that, I really rejected a lot of that in my 20s. And a lot of the people that I kind of grew up with, the big celebration was people going into the ministry. And I really knew that that's not something that was for me, not something I wanted to do. So as I've gotten older, though, I really do believe I have a gift of kind of community, spiritual community, and putting people together and helping make God make sense for people. And sometimes it's just because it's a road that I've walked. I don't know that the director title is a little hard for me, but I'm somewhat comforted in it, knowing that I'm just a few steps ahead of some people. And so that. And if I'm chasing kind of the wisdom tradition, that's where the Enneagram comes out of. The wisdom tradition is it's more general wisdom, generalized spiritual wisdom than it is like specific spiritual wisdom. And it really is, for me, it, like I said earlier, it really does make my life make sense. So it's, I worked in music for a long time and really loved that. But a big part of that was me backstage having spiritual conversations with people. So it's like I've always been doing it. And then I was introduced to the kind of the concept of it about 5 years ago, and went through a 3-year program, and so gained a lot of like there's a lot of routes you can go down with it. It's related in terms to typically like there's like some Catholic practice, there's some Buddhist practice, and there's a few other things. And so, but in a way, the discovery of it felt like, oh, I don't have to be a pastor. I don't have to become a pastor for this like spiritual side of my life to make sense. And in a way, I do play kind of a pastoral role for some people. But as a spiritual director, I'm not involved in people's day-to-day lives. So I typically see them once a month, a lot like a therapist would. So I am in a way a coach for them. People do disclose things to me. It's confidential, it's private. There's a lot of tears. There's a lot of things that we're working through. Sometimes people bring a lot to the table, and sometimes it really is me sort of just listening to them and helping guide them to a new place. So yeah, the process of becoming a director it should be a few years process for people. And the program I chose was a 3-year program, and had a lot of practical work involved with it as well. So, but it's not a formalized. It's not as formal as like becoming a therapist or a counselor. It's not as formal as becoming a pastor or something like that. So it's sort of a certification-based thing, kind of life coach-esque.
I like it. So if somebody's listening to this and is like, you know what, I think that's a good step for me. Do you Google spiritual directors? Like, what's your guidance in how they should start the process?
Yeah, you can certainly check out my website. I'm happy to follow up with you. I not all spiritual directors are the right fit for everyone. So I don't believe I'm the right fit for every person. I have friends I make a lot of recommendations to, referrals to. And then really the easiest place to start, honestly, is there's a website. It's Spiritual Directors International. So the website is www.sdiworld.org. And or you can Google spiritual directors near me and see what you find. There's been a couple of recent, there's a great New York Times article that came out a couple of months ago. So if you want to Google spiritual direction New York Times, you'll find that article. There's a great Huffington Post article that I see a lot. I have a number of articles on my website that are built around what to ask a spiritual director, because you do sort of an interview process. Typically, you do kind of an initial consultation and then decide if that's the person you want to go to. Because again, it's like a counselor. If you've ever been to a counselor and you're like, this wasn't a good fit, but there are other counselors, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot like that. And you can sort of custom tailor what you're looking for too. I always tell people that I'm not touchy-feely. And so if you're looking for like a real, like I might cry with you, but it's probably not going to happen. But if you want someone who's going to cry along with you, there are definitely those. Or if you're way more into a specific practice, like if you want more of your spiritual direction sessions to be more maybe meditation oriented or centering prayer oriented, or if you're Catholic and you want it's called the Ignatian way. So if you want that true classic Catholic spiritual director, you should probably find that classic Catholic spiritual director. That's not me, but there's definitely. So if you go to sdiworld.org, they actually have a great search filter, and you can pick young or old, male, female, denominational interests, all those things, and it will pull in available spiritual directors based on your sort of filter preferences.
I love that. I love knowing that. I'm so glad that we had this conversation. Friends, if you're listening to this and you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up on the YouTube. I know that sounds so lame, but the algorithm is obsessed with it, I promise. And also like and comment below. I will make sure that if you comment, Aaron sees the comments, and I will be his conduit so that you guys can be in conversation in that way. And if you like the channel, do the YouTube-y things, like, subscribe, the whole thing. It's been a great conversation, and I get to have a lot of these. It's a real honor in my life. So Aaron, thank you so much for joining me. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Let's talk about the Enneagram scene.
Yes, that sounds like a ton of fun because I know very little. I know a lot about my type and how I work through the world, but I don't know a lot about everything else. So
yeah, that's great.
I'm gonna resend you my link and let's get you on the calendar.
We'll do it.
So, okay, friends, this has been Welcome to My World. My guest has been Aaron Maines. I'm Dr. Kristen Donnelly, and I'll see you next time. Bye.